right, we got a question here from Jiwaka Kanagaraj. I hope the pronunciation is reasonable, Jiwaka. Question is there an official government procedure when you buy a property to get a residency visa? So I imagine you want to know, if there is a specific way in which the property must be purchased. And the answer is yes. And it's always good to ask this question before you buy the property, because if you buy a property that does not qualify, you're not going to be able to apply for the residency. So, indeed, to know exactly the factors considered is pretty important. I'm going to go over some of the aspects, but there is always something that I may forget to address. So I usually recommend for people who are serious about buying a property to schedule a consultation so we can go over the requirements in details. But let's jump right into it. So the first requirement is that the property is urban. In other words, you cannot buy, for instance, a farm. Even if a farm does meet the minimum requirement, a farm is not going to be considered a property that is capable of getting you the residency. Another distinction is that the property is already constructed or in the process of being built by a large developer who can provide the required paperwork. So if you're just buying a plot of land, even if the plot of land is in an urban environment, the plot of land is not going to qualify unless there is a developer who's going to provide the license paperwork for the construction, and not only the license, the incorporation licenses as well. Other requirements are related, of course, to the amount, and you probably know that the minimum amount is going to be 1 million reais in most of the country, except the northeast and the north of Brazil. So Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and everywhere else is going to be 1 million reais. But if you're buying in the northeast, for instance, Fortaleza, Salvador, or if you're buying in the Amazon, then you're going to be able to get the residency for 30% less. So in today's money, that would be 700,000 reais. And you need to meet those requirements because when you apply for the residency, the application is going to include, for instance, a deed for the property, right? The government wants to read the deed and they want to make sure that this is a urban property, that there is a construction in place, and so on. You're going to show a contract because the contract is going to tell how much you're paying for the property. And you're also going to need to present, among other papers, the currency exchange contract. So the government is going to know that the money is coming from abroad, that you're not using money that is already in the country. Okay? Um, Other requirements related to sending the money into the country, there are like official channels, like banks that were authorized by the Brazilian government to do currency exchange, and it is necessary that you use such channels. Okay, we see every now and then someone who's been using the so-called money apps such as Wise or Remitly, and of course there is a limit on how much you can send. And as a consequence, usually these buyers they are going to send a bunch of remittances in small amounts, and eventually they have the entire money in the country to buy the property. But the problem is when it gets to the time of application, you're not going to have a currency exchange contract because you sent by the so-called apps. And whenever you send it by the apps, you have usually a cap of $10,000 per remittance, but you don't get the currency exchange contract, which again, it's one of the requirements for the application. I see here Dario Burke. Dario, thank you for participating. Thank you for watching our videos. And yes, if you have any questions, let us know so we can answer here in our live. So one of the questions we hear often here at the firm is about where to buy real estate, and it's usually like, should I buy in a major city like Rio de Janeiro, or should I go to Fortaleza, for instance, in the Northeast, where prices are lower? Where should I buy? And of course, the main factor is going to be a personal preference, right? Some people, they absolutely love Rio de Janeiro, so they are willing to pay premium prices to be in Rio de Janeiro. And that's not something that we can tell you, like Fortaleza or Rio de Janeiro is a better choice, because again, it's a matter of personal preference. This said, um, there are some important aspects of the location where you're going to buy. We usually recommend you to go with a location that is well known by other foreign citizens, and I can explain why. Let's say you buy a property, like if you buy a high price property, when it comes to the time of selling, like if you decided to sell in the future, you want to have enough buyers around, to show interest and eventually to buy your property. And this is going to happen, for instance, like if you're buying in Rio de Janeiro, usually the properties that are going to be targeted by foreign citizens are those properties by the coast, naturally, right? So we had a person like, a few months ago, she was trying to sell property in the inner country in Rio de Janeiro state. So it was far from the beaches. It was more like a countryside environment, like in the middle of the forest, of the Mata Atlântica. And it was an amazing property. Like I saw the pictures, it was a really high-end construction. The furniture, the architecture, everything was of a really, very good taste. However, that area in particular is not primarily targeted by foreign citizens. Okay, most of the buyers in the area, they are going to be Brazilians, and because this person invested so much money to build that particular house, there was no buyer around it to even make an offer, right? So that's a consideration for you to think of when picking the area. If you're gonna, pick either like Rio de Janeiro, it could be Ceará, where Fortaleza is. It could be Santa Catarina, where Florianópolis is. It could be any state in Brazil. The point is, when you're buying, particularly if you're buying a higher end property, if you're buying a lower end property, that's not much of a concern, because you always have like a number of Brazilian buyers who could be buying the property from you. But if you are actually, buying something really high end, our recommendation is that you stick with the traditional cities and neighborhoods that are going to be, a better choice when it comes to the time of uh, selling this property in the future. All right. All right. I see here Dario is asking about the purchase of autos. Is not really in the scope of real estate, but we can tell you, Dario, that for autos, like you gonna most probably have to use a currency exchange bank if it is like a high end auto. Let's say if you're buying a brand new BMW, that could easily cost in Brazil like 100,000 US dollars, and for that you're gonna need to use a currency exchange bank. And by using a currency exchange bank, usually the receiving party is going to need to provide the paperwork, right? So in this case, if you're buying an auto, you're going to be buying from a dealership, an authorized dealership for BMW. So they would be providing the paperwork. Now, as you may imagine, like the dealership may not be interested in providing a bunch of papers that they would not need to provide if they were selling the car to a Brazilian, right? So in this case, it's kind of common for the dealership to refuse to provide the required paperwork and to tell the buyer, listen, buyer, I'm happy to sell you this car, but in terms of paperwork, that's your problem. Take care of the paperwork. Once you have money in the country, then you come back and I'm gonna sell you the car. So if you buy the car for a Brazilian party, this Brazilian, uh, there is a plan B that we saw happening more than once here at the farm. There would be a donation transaction from the foreign citizen to the Brazilian party. So the Brazilian party is going to receive this money in a wire transfer. But again, the currency exchange bank, which is the bank for the Brazilian party, is going to need to handle the paperwork. And the paperwork for this circumstance would most probably be a donation paperwork. And the result is that the Brazilian party is going to need to pay the donation tax on the money being received. Okay, so that's really an overview. Daryl, if you are interested in pursuing that route, you can schedule a consultation here at the firm, and we would be happy to discuss the details with you. And we have another question from Casey on three. I've seen commercial properties in Central that are much cheaper than residential. Are we able to stay overnight a few times a week, or is it illegal? Okay, so Casey, it really depends on where the commercial property is located. I can give you an example. We have, let's say, if you're talking about Rio de Janeiro, we have one of our main offices in the city of Rio de Janeiro, Avenida Rio Branco, which is in downtown Rio de Janeiro. Okay, and this particular building has a really good professional, management company taking care of the entire building, and they do not allow people to sleep or to stay overnight. It doesn't matter if it's going to be a single time, a couple of times, or multiple times, right? They are going to literally tell you to leave the building at a certain time, which in our building is like 8 p.m., unless you give notice that you're going to have something that you need to work on it, like for an additional time. And probably the maximum we can stay in our office in the city of Rio de Janeiro is 10 p.m. Okay, but that's a huge building with, I don't know, like dozens, if not hundreds of commercial units. Now, let's say if you're buying a storage, right, a storage facility, like a single building storage in the city of Rio de Janeiro, in theory, like you would need to have a license for people to live in that particular building. But from a practical perspective, there's not going to be anyone chasing you, right? Unless you're doing like a lot of noise in the evening, So your neighbors could be, of course, like complaining about the noise that you're doing. But the point is, it's pretty common for people who have commercial properties and they have like full control of the premises to eventually, either sleep at the property for some reason. Maybe they are, working on a tight deadline, or maybe they are gonna keep like a secured person taking care of the property. So that would be very common for people to sleep in the property, even though it's a commercial property. But again, if it is like a building, like a well-managed building with like suites or commercial rooms, most likely than not, they are not going to allow anyone to live or to sleep in the building. Interesting enough, in Rio de Janeiro now there are hybrid buildings that are going to combine commercial units and residential units as well. In the same avenue where we have our office, Avenida Rio Branco, downtown Rio de Janeiro, there are many buildings that are going to have this kind of mixed use of the premises. I have here another a question from Jiwaka. What is the criteria for urban properties to qualify for the Brazil Golden Visa? Will a small fishing village would be considered urban, as most expats would like a remote beachfront property? Well, very interesting. I love remote beach front properties. I myself, I spend a lot of time in the state of Ceará, in the cities of Beberibe, Morro Branco, and Canoa Quebrada. So I am 100% on this one with you. Now, answering specifically on the urban requirement. So there is a specific legal requirement for a property to be considered urban, and this is commanded by the type of taxes that are paid on the property. Okay, so if the property is paying the IPTU, IPTU is the annual property taxes paid by urban property. So you're paying IPTU, urban property. If you're not paying IPTU, you're gonna be paying a different type of tax that is called uh, ITB. I'm not exactly, I don't recall exactly the name of the tax, but it's not IPTU. Okay, so it's either IPTU, or it's gonna be the rural property tax. And that's how an authority is gonna decide if the property is urban or not. And just because we're talking about the fishing village type of properties, most of them, when it's like closer to downtown, in this fishing village type of town, they are going to be considered urban, and the municipality, the city, is going to make sure that you're paying the ITBI, because excuse me, the IPTU, because that's how they are going to get money. If the property is rural, the municipality is not going to get the taxes. The taxes are actually going to go to a mix of the state and the federal government, right? So you see that the towns, they are usually go above board to make sure that that property is considered from a tax perspective to be a urban property. Okay, a question from Daryl. Am I able to partner with development companies to build apartment or condominium buildings? And the answer is yes, you would be able to do so. And interesting enough, we do have, like this kind of question in our consultations. Every now and then we see like foreign citizens, they want to go to Brazil, and they have enough money to actually develop, not just buy a single property, but to develop a set of properties, sometimes even to sell to other foreign citizens. So the partnership in theory is possible, of course. There is always the kind of red tape complexity that we see happening in Brazil. So there is even like a phrase. I'm not sure if you heard it before, but it says like Brasil não é para amadores, right? So Brazil is not for beginners. It's not for amateurs. Like there is a lot of red tape. There is always the possibility of fraud. Like to get paperwork for construction, sometimes it's a monumental, challenge. And but if you have a qualified local partner who could, get such license, in theory, yes, absolutely, you would be able to develop yourself a set of properties and potentially, if you have a network abroad, even sell to this network abroad. Again, the heads up about the complexity in terms of obtaining the licenses, the incorporation paperwork, which is separate from the license to build, right? These are two separate things. You need a license to build, so you're physically building stuff. The second one is the incorporation paperwork, which is going to allow you to sell individual units to the public abroad. So, question from Casey on three. How do you see the housing market in Florianopolis? Will prices be going up? Noticed a 5% increase in a year's time. So, yes, I mean, Florianopolis, Santa Catarina in general, or the south of Brazil for that matter, it's a pretty stable, a pretty safe investment. Is seen as a pretty safe investment, right? Like you never know the future. But so far, and I'm not sure if you saw, like we have some interviews with a realtor from Florianopolis, and we discuss in details about what's going on with Florianopolis in terms of attracting foreign citizens, in terms of the future of Florianopolis. But the south of Brazil, it's a pretty traditional market. You have actually a really decent base of national buyers. And particularly when you have names such as Florianopolis, Camboriú, and beachfront, towns, you have also a number of foreign buyers that are always making this market dynamic, and you do see the increase in terms of properties becoming more valuable. Now, the 5% increase, I'm always like concerned about throwing numbers out there, particularly when you are discussing with a realtor. Realtors are gonna say, you know what, like you can, get 10% a year. Some of them they're gonna even say that you could get a 15% return. But the truth is, like usually the returns are gonna be around 5%. And it also depends on how you are, managing your property. If you're doing like short-term rentals, or if you have like a traditional type of tenant, like it really depends on how you're managing your property. But I would say that returns around 5% are more customary in terms of Brazilian real estate market, right? If someone tells you that you're gonna get guaranteed 8% or 10%, that's a red flag. That's something that's not taking you seriously, and is just throwing numbers there, in order to have a buyer, right? So 5%, a reasonable number. Some years you could get more, some years you could get less, but there is no such a thing as a guaranteed, return on your money of 8%. Okay, now we have a question from Jiwaka. on behalf of digital nomads who are so confused about taxes, even though the digital nomad visa requires you are working for a non-Brazilian company. Do you still need to pay Brazilian taxes, even though you have a digital nomad visa? So there is no positioning by the Brazilian government when it comes to the digital nomad visa, and that's pretty common. And in Brazil, it works just like it works in other countries. For instance, like the United States, usually you have different departments addressing different aspects of living in the country as a foreign citizen. So in Brazil, it works like this: like the immigration department of the federal government, they are gonna tell you how you can stay in Brazil, but usually they are not gonna address taxes because there is another department, of course, the Department of Taxation. In Brazil, we call it Receita Federal, right, or the Federal Revenue Service, kind of similar to the Internal Revenue Service of the U.S. And they are going to be the ones telling the public what is going to, how it's going to work from a taxation perspective. And nowadays, if you speak with most accountants who specialize in cross-border taxes, they are going to tell you that a digital nomad, once they get a visa, they do not automatically become a tax resident. However, once they are in the country for 184 days, they are going to become a tax resident, right? And what does it mean to become a tax resident? And like, a heads up that this is really a really high view of the taxation situation about digital nomads. You should not rely on my advisory because each situation is going to be different. So you should retain a Brazilian CPA to go over your plans, your projects, to have like a more thorough analysis review of your specifics. This said, once you've been in the country for 184 days, the understanding coming from the CPAs is that you become a tax resident. Now, once you are a tax resident, you will need to pay in Brazil taxes over your income in Brazil. So let's say if you're renting, if you have a couple of apartments in Florianopolis, you're gonna pay in Brazil the taxes related to those two properties. However, in addition to that, Brazil is gonna look at your income abroad, right? So let's say if you are from the United States, Brazil is gonna tax you on the two properties you have in Brazil, and Brazil is going to look at your income in the United States. And then there is a type of compensation approach that is similar in Brazil and the US, and it works kind of like this. If you're paying in the US a 20% tax bracket on your US income, and in Brazil, you would be in a 17.5% tax bracket. Brazil is going to say, you know what, you're paying more than what I would be charging here in Brazil over your US income. Therefore, you're not going to need to pay anything, right? And the US would do something similar. So if in the US you're paying a 20% tax bracket, and if you already paid 17.5% of your income in Brazil for the two apartments, in the US, you would pay only the difference, the 2.5% on your Brazilian income, right? Because that's the difference, that's the gap between the tax brackets. Now, this is, of course, a very simplified explanation. There are exceptions, therefore, the need for you to consult with a Brazilian CPA to have a more definite answer on the taxation applied to digital nomad visa holders in Brazil. All right, a couple of questions from Dario. Does your firm provide the service of reviewing the partnership contracts and paperwork? or it's a commercial realtor better? You know, whenever you talk about contracts, like realtors, they are not allowed by law, and most probably even like from experience or skill set, to evaluate contracts or to advise on contracts, right? That would be similar in the US and Brazil. Realtors, they are able to only work with forms, right? If it's a form, they can work with the form, they can fill out the gaps, but no realtor can advise on contracts. So if you talking about a partnership contract or even like a development contract, you must hire an attorney for that purpose. We do work with contract drafting, review, negotiation, and so forth, and we would be pleased to provide you with a quote. Or if you want to schedule a consultation, we can also discuss about your plans. I think that the consultation is really, really helpful because before you get yourself uh, uh, too invested in that path, to have our experience in terms of reviewing your ideas and plans, that's pretty helpful for you to know if you are on the right track or not. Another question: in the US, there is a credit for taxes paid abroad. In the US, there is a tax credit for taxes paid abroad for countries that don't have a an agreement, right? Like, I mean, some type of partnership or agreement in terms of how to handle taxes. So I think you are stating, that's not a question, you are stating like in the US, there is a credit, right, for taxes paid abroad. So that's in line of what I said, you know, like Brazil and the US, they have like similar approach when it comes to taxation. They don't want you to pay double taxes, right? Like any country that is enforcing double taxes is going to be scaring people away. So I think both Brazil and the U.S. They are aware of you know this risk and they want to avoid. So Brazil it also does apply the credit approach in a sense that whatever you've been paying abroad to the U.S., for instance, is going to be considered as a credit against any tax liability that you would have in Brazil. Dario is saying thank you for all your informative videos. Thank you for watching our videos, Dario. We understand that you know, like legal services, they are not really accessible to everyone. Like there are, you know, like there are foreign citizens from some countries where it makes difficult for them to pay for a legal service. So our idea is to put the content out there so people can benefit from this content. And when it gets to the time of making a serious decision, such as buying a property, they can hire us at least, you know, for a consultation, so we can review their plans and make sure they are on the right path. And is very common, particularly for our clients from the U.S. Our professional fees, they're very affordable for a U.S. client, right? Again, not for every country, but for countries such as the U.S., Canada, the U.K., and so on. Our rates are pretty affordable, and we usually work throughout the cycle of purchasing a real estate, from reviewing the initial paperwork to the moment when the new deed is issued on the buyer's name. All right. Question here from Thomas Fleming. I read your website about transferring money to Brazil for the purpose of buying property. It seemed extremely difficult, even with professional help. Is this an accurate interpretation? So, Thomas, unfortunately, still today there is this kind of it's a historical reality that we have in terms of monies coming into the country. So just to exemplify, just to explain how it works, right? So if you make a wire transfer from the U.S. To the UK of $100,000, you spend 5 minutes on your Chase bank account, Wells Fargo bank account, whatever bank you use in the US, and the money, worst case scenario, is going to show up in the recipient's bank account in the UK on the next day, right? Now, in Brazil, no money is going to show up at all because whenever you send a large remittance to Brazil, the recipient bank is going to need by law, right? It's not by choice, right? Banks, they are not crazy. They want to handle their business and move on to the next customer. So it is by law that they need to complete a full inspection of the underlying transaction. Okay, so if you're buying a property in Brazil and if you're sending a large amount, there is no work around. Like the recipient bank is going to need to handle a compliance process addressing things such as the contract. They are going to look at the contract. They are going to look at the sellers of the property. They are going to look at the deed, believe it or not. It gets to that point. The bank is going to inspect this transaction in order to document its due diligence because every year the Brazilian central bank, they are going to run an audit, and basically they are going to audit every single bank. What the bank doesn't know is like the degree of the audit, if it's going to be a high level auditing or if they are going to go into the details. And when they are handling an audit, it's very common for the bank to pick a few transactions and then go over into details to make sure that the Brazilian bank did ask and kept copies for every single major document. All right. So I think that just by mentioning those steps, you understand like that this is not a check, like a check, checking a box that is going to make your money get into Brazil. It is going to require some level of involvement between you as the buyer, between the bank, and between the sellers, right? Now, some firms like ours, like we've been doing that for a couple of decades now. So we have like all these processes. We know exactly how it works. So when we work with a client, we're gonna take them by the hands and we're gonna try to avoid like all this burden on the client. We ask the things that we know that the bank is gonna need, and we communicate with the bank to make the transaction work as smoothly as possible for our clients. Okay, and we are not the only ones doing so. There are other professionals. There are like some financial agents. There are some firms that specialize in what we call structuring the money remittance, and that's what is going to make your life easier, right? Unfortunately, some people they don't think about that up front. They sign a contract, and this contract is going to say that they are going to close 30 days after signing the contract. And then when it's like 1 week for the closing date, that's when the US citizen is going to realize that sending money to Brazil is not easy. And as a consequence, unfortunately, it's not uncommon for the US buyer to incur hefty penalties, right? When you sign a contract, there is usually in Brazil at least a 10% penalty over the price of the property if you don't perform by the closing date. So just by knowing that there is some level of challenge and preparing yourself, right? Like you could, instead of saying the contract that you're going to close in 30 days, you could say that you're going to close it in 60 or even 90 days. So you have enough time to navigate through whatever it's required to have the money by the closing date. I hope that helps. All right, good news from Casey, exciting news. I will be buying a home in Floripa in June or July of 24th. So you need help. We will definitely seek your help with this. Appreciate it. Congratulations, Casey. Great market. I love Floripa. I'm not sure if you saw our recent videos about Florianopolis. We did interview a realtor that works in Florianopolis, but he's from the UK, right? So the communication was pretty great, and he did share a lot of interesting tips, and I think it's worth to watch those videos. But yes, when the right time comes, let us know. We're gonna be happy to get into a consultation and make your journey as uh, you know as tranquil as possible and keep you away from the challenges and issues that buying a property cross border may bring. Okay, question here from Daryl Burke: is the investing in the stocks of Brazilian companies considered eligible for a visa? And the answer is no, it's not, Daryl. In Brazil, you have two main paths, to buy residency, right? That's what people want to do. They have money, they want to buy residency. And the two paths are going to be either real estate, which is the most straightforward route. And the second route is like to invest in a company in Brazil. Investing in a company in Brazil, historically, it's not a great idea for foreign citizens. The red tape in Brazil is across the board, and that means to run a company, particularly if you are from a country in the US where you can open a company literally on the same day, right? Like there are some firms that you pay like a rush fee and you can open a company on the same day and get the federal identification, the EIN number on the same day, right? Like Brazil is a different universe, right? So just to open a company, we have some clients that unfortunately it takes over 6 months for them just to open the company because you're going to need to translate every single document that you have in your company abroad. If you're going to bring your company from abroad, if you're going to invest in a local company, then you're going to need to hire a number of employees, and the volume of tax obligations that you're going to assume, in our opinion, they are just not worth the trouble, right? So if you come to us and say, Luciano, I want to hire you to help me get my residency through investment in a company, we're not going to be able to take you aboard just because we think, down the road, you're going to look at us and say, why didn't you tell me I was, I was going this route, and now I have, labor lawsuits, I have, all the taxation craziness. So we would not advise you to follow on that route. In terms of stocks, a different question we hear every now and then is, okay, what about real estate investment funds? Will that qualify for the real estate investment route? And the answer is no. You need to actually buy a property, and you're going to need to present during the time of application for the residency, you're going to need to present the deed for a specific property showing your name on the deed, right? So if you're just buying real estate investment funds, or if you're investing in a company and this company has a bunch of properties in the company's portfolio, is not the same thing as providing a deed with your personal name on it. So the short answer is like no, investing in stocks by any means is not gonna get you the residency in Brazil. We have a question here from Amjad Islan. Uh, do you have an office in Dubai or any other cities in the area? Amjad, unfortunately, we don't have, but we do have a lot of clients from the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, in particular. Like we have clients buying properties across Brazil. Not surprisingly, like like we have some very affluent clients in the Emirates, and they do buy properties in Brazil often. Okay, so no offices in Dubai, unfortunately, but we are familiar with the process. To give you an example, we know that there is no such a thing as apostille in Brazil, like when you need to provide the documents to buy a property in Brazil. So you actually need to have your documents legalized by the Brazilian embassy. It's not a consulate, it's the Brazilian embassy in Abu Dhabi, not Dubai. So our clients would hire, like we have a partner service provider in Dubai. They actually take the documents, they schedule an appointment in the Brazilian embassy in Abu Dhabi. So the documents can be legalized. So then you can buy the properties you want in Brazil. So yes, we do have experience with clients from the Middle East, but no offices over there. But nowadays our consultations they are over Zoom, which make it very convenient for you to meet with us. It does not matter where you are. And through partnerships, we are able to take care of all the legalization steps. Unfortunately, there is a huge level of red tape in Brazil real estate transactions, and our purpose, our goal is to make the transaction as smooth as possible for you as a buyer. Thomas Fleming, if I'm buying a property for $200,000, approximately how much are your fees for helping with the entire process? Thomas, we don't have like a preset fee. It really depends on many particulars, like we take into consideration in which city you're buying, if you're gonna need our assistance with the residency application. We also take into consideration if you have the property or not, if you need our help to find the property. So there are many variables to be considered. And just to give you an idea about how intensive our work is, usually in a single real estate transaction, we have between 300 and 400 points of communication, of contact with parties such as the realtors, the registries where the closing is going to take place. We also interact with a second registry that is actually the one that's going to issue the deed. We interact with like due diligence partners who are going to run, due diligence search on the property, on the sellers, because there is another important aspect that foreign citizens they don't know upfront. But in Brazil, we don't have two things that are pretty common in the United States and some other countries. In the United States, you have the title insurance, right? Title insurance means whenever you're buying a property, let's say if you buy a property from a seller who does not have a legal title, right? Like everybody thought, all right, the seller lives in the property, they should be able to sell this property, and you buy the property, and a year down the road, you realized you bought the property from someone who could not have sold the property. The insurance is going to basically give your money back, right? Of course, first they're going to fight against whatever claims are showing up. But if at the end of the day they lose it, they're going to give your money back. So in Brazil, there is no title insurance. So if you buy a property from someone who does not have the legal right of selling the property, you are on your own. And we like to say good luck suing the seller. Brazilians usually always have some destination for funds, right? So if they sell you a property for roughly R$ 1 million, $200,000, once you try to recover this money, the money is usually gone. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is, believe it or not, there is no escrow in Brazil. There is no escrow, right? Like in the U.S., if you're buying a property, usually there's going to be a title company such as Chicago Title. They are going to handle both the insurance and they are going to handle the escrow, which means your money is going to be safe until the sellers actually sign the deed of sale, right? So we don't have such a thing in Brazil. So believe it or not, many buyers, they are going to basically just trust the seller. They're going to send the money up front, trusting that the seller is going to be doing the right thing by signing the deed of sale, right? And that happens in most of the cases. As you may imagine, the sellers know that if they don't sign, of course, you're going to sue them. But when the buyer is a foreign citizen, the sellers also know it's going to be more difficult for the seller to sue them locally in Brazil. So I would say that foreign citizens are right to be concerned about that. And what we do here at the firm, we try to emulate an escrow by working with a partner currency exchange bank. And the way it works is like this: you're going to send the monies to the seller, but you're going to send the monies to the seller through our partner bank. Our partner bank is going to park the funds until the day of the closing. And the funds, they are not going to be released until the day of the closing. And if something happens in the meantime, let's say if the due diligence shows that the sellers could not be selling uh, the, the property, you are still able to recall the money, okay? But this is not going to happen with any type of bank. If you are using the seller's bank, for instance, right? The seller's bank is going to most probably be one of the everyday banks in Brazil, and they are going to have zero communication with you, right? They just own a duty of communication with the seller. So once your money is sent, like there is no calling this money back. And that's why we work with a partner bank, because then we are able to recall the money. And this is a type of a workaround, or we're trying to emulate an escrow, because again, in Brazil, there is no escrow accounts. All right, Tim Edwards. Tim Edwards is asking, if you buy a property for 700,000 reais in the Northeast, let's say Salvador, which is a pretty common destination for foreign buyers. We have a transaction to be closed on the 8th of December as we speak. Uh, and his question is, and you then want to apply for the real estate visa, is there a time limit within which to do this, right? So basically, team wants to know, like, I buy this property, maybe I'm not sure if I want to ask for the residency, but what about a couple of years down the road, I decide to do so? Can I still do so? So As of today, you could do that later on, right? And the time limit is gonna be dictated by two things. Okay, the first one is gonna be the amount, right? The 700,000 amount and the 1 million thousand amount for other regions was defined when this visa was created back in 2018. So basically, we're gonna be, you know, 6 years down the road with the same amount as a requirement. So I think it would make sense for the Brazilian government to update the required amount anytime soon. And if you're buying a 700,000 property and then you're not applying for the visa, maybe you're applying, let's say in 2025, maybe in 2025 the amount is not 700 anymore, maybe it's 1.2 million reais, right? So in this case, most probably than not, the Brazilian government is going to say, well, your problem, now you need 1.2 million reais, and if you didn't apply back then, that's your problem, not mine, right? That would be the most probable approach by the Brazilian government. That's the first issue. The second issue is in 2018, the federal government was run by President Bolsonaro, which did create most of these modern visas we have nowadays. They were created by President Bolsonaro. Our current president, of course, he's an antagonist of President Bolsonaro. President Bolsonaro was like, from the right, and the current president Lula is from the left. So President Lula is undoing some of the things that President Bolsonaro did. However, these visas that President Bolsonaro did, they are so good for the country from an immigration perspective. I mean, they are opening like doors for people to go to Brazil by bringing a lot of money. Of course, good for the country, and in exchange they could have residence. So we believe it's improbable that President Lula is going to undo such type of visa, but you never know, right? Like you can tell. Like I mean, as we speak, like President Lula is like reviving the requirement for U.S. citizens to have a visa to visit Brazil. During President Bolsonaro administration, President Bolsonaro said this is nonsense. Like U.S. citizens, they come to Brazil with a ton of money. Is a really bad idea to ask for a visa, right? Which kind of sounds like a common sense thinking, but President Lula doesn't think like that. He thinks there should be reciprocity, meaning that if the U.S. is asking Brazilians for a visa to visit the U.S., Brazil should ask U.S. citizens for a visa to visit Brazil, right? Now, of course, there is a matter of context, right? You don't have any U.S. citizens crossing rivers to come into Brazil, but there is a ton of Brazilian citizens crossing rivers to get into the U.S. So, the analogy is not that easy. But anyhow, the current federal administration, it's undoing things that were created by the prior administration as we speak. So, again, uh, the answer is even though nowadays you can use a property that you bought a couple of years ago to apply for the residency visa, it could be the case that a couple of years from today, if you buy the property today, there's going to be either a change in required amount or even like some extreme change in the visa itself, which could be a problem for you as the applicant. All right, there is a question from Skip Lulu. Hi, CPF numbers for foreigners and for Brazilians work the same. I saw someone posted on Facebook that he has a CPF number for foreigner, but he can't get a SIM card at Claro store because the system does not recognize it. Okay, so the CPF, so we can make a connection to today's team of real estate. Uh, the CPF is the Brazilian tax ID, and to buy a property in Brazil, you must have the Brazilian tax ID. You are unable to legally own real estate in Brazil unless you have a Brazilian CPF. Okay, so to apply for the CPF until October the 11th, right? We're talking about a month ago. Um, we have actually a guide on our website which you could basically just follow and apply by email, and you would get the CPF number by email. Unfortunately, on October 11th, like the federal government said, this is too easy. Okay, no good, too easy. Now they closed that door, and now you need to apply at either a consulate. So if you are in the US, you could go to a consulate in Atlanta, in Houston, New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles. There is a bunch of consulates in the US. And of course, for any other countries, like you most probably will have either a Brazilian consulate, if it is like a large country, if it is a smaller country, usually a single Brazilian embassy, right? And then you can just go there and apply for the Brazilian CPF. And the only explanation you need to give, I want to buy property in Brazil, they're going to give you a thumbs up, they're going to help you get. Now, we are able to get the Brazilian tax ID through a POF attorney. If the client is buying a property with our help, as part of the service, we're going to get the Brazilian tax ID known as CPF as part of the process, right? Now, answering specifically Skippy Lulu's question, what's the distinction? Why, this type of CPF is not working for people trying to use the cell phone service? And I can explain. During the setup of a cell phone service, uh, the, the operator, like the cell phone company, they want to ask you for which state you are based, right? In which state? And of course, they're talking about a Brazilian state. So if the foreign citizen is getting the CPF, the foreign citizen is not going to get a CPF attached or linked to a Brazilian state because he lives abroad. So when the cell phone company tries to do this matching, it doesn't match, it doesn't connect because again, the CPF that was issued for the foreign citizen, it was linked to an address abroad. So that's the reason why the CPF is not going to work for a cell phone application. Okay. Now the workaround, again, going back to the real estate team that we are addressing today, if you are buying real estate in Brazil and then you apply for the residency, eventually you're gonna get the RNM, which is a kind of a green card, the Brazilian green card, right? For foreign citizens. And this Brazilian green card is accepted as a Brazilian ID anywhere. So instead of trying to get the service like by simply using the dial pad on the cell phone, you go physically uh, to one of the stores from the cell phone company, and they are going to set up the service on the spot for you. So that's the workaround for foreign citizens. All right, everyone. We are over 1 hour in our live. Thank you very much for sharing your questions. Thank you very much for sharing these constructive thoughts. I think it was very helpful for everyone who has participated in this live. If you didn't get an opportunity to ask your question, we're going to have another live next Sunday at the very same time. So if you still have questions, or if you think you're going to have more questions after you move over the information that you got today, just come back like next week on Sunday, the very same time, 3:30 Rio de Janeiro time, and you can ask your questions. Thank you for joining us and see you in our next live.